We're looking forward to a special day on Monday. CBS This Morning will come to you from the new Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington. We'll talk with many special guests about the museum's own history and the important events that it commemorates.
And only on CBS This Morning, here to discuss his experience as a former mayor of Richmond, Virginia, once the capital of the Confederacy, is Senator Tim Kaine. The Democratic vice presidential candidate, when he was mayor, Kaine offered the first formal apology for Richmond's role in the slave trade. He was Virginia's governor in 2007 when it became the first state to apologize for slavery. Kaine was a civil rights lawyer who joined Richmond City Council in 1994, and he earned a reputation as a bridge builder at a time when the city's racial divisions were still quite stark. Senator Tim Kaine, we welcome you to the table at CBS This Morning.
Thanks. So nice to be here with you this morning.
So an apology twice. Why did you think that was necessary? Very unusual for many people.
Richmond is a beautiful city. I've been there 32 years, but we've got history and we got scar tissue. And one of the bits of scar tissue we have is that we were one of the centers of the slave trade in the United States. First slaves came into the English colonies in Jamestown in 1619. Richmond became one of the centers of the slave trade. And it wasn't just that the city was a bystander. The officialdom in the city defended and really promoted the institution of slavery. And I thought it was important for the mayor to offer an apology, not to end a discussion, but to start a discussion. And I felt the same way when I became governor.
Should the president?
Look, I think it's a good thing to do. I think it's a good thing to do because it opens up a discussion. The thing that's exciting about the museum, many things exciting about the museum opening is, again, it will be a generator of discussion about stories that haven't been told and you know, wounds that still last to today.
And in many ways, you have to acknowledge the past and embrace the past before you can move to the future.
Faulkner said something great. He said, history is the attempt to create a usable past. If it's just about the past, well, maybe you don't spend that much time on it, but I do think we can use the past in the right way. It was a Virginian Jefferson who said our North Star as a nation is going to be equality. Even though he wasn't living that way, even though no one was living that way, they were still smart enough to say that will be our North Star. And we've been a nation orienting towards that and sometimes away from it. But more often than not, thank goodness, orienting towards it ever since, knocking down one barrier after the next. A sailor never gets to the North Star and will never be perfect.
Should there be a legislative remedy? In other words, should there be reparations for descendants of slaves?
I definitely think, look, the weight of discrimination in the country, if you look at 400 years since Africans came as slaves to Jamestown, divided into 8 half-centuries. For 5 of the 8 half-centuries, Africans were here as slaves. For 2 of the 8 half-centuries, there was legalized, separate but equal, legalized discrimination even though slavery had been outlawed. And only for the last half-century have African Americans been entitled legally to equality. So the weight of that is very, very consequential. I've tended to focus on things, how can we address the weight of it? And I've tended to focus on things like education strategies and investments, and that's what Hillary Clinton believes too. I think you acknowledge the consequences, but then you try to solve them through investments in communities that have been left behind. In Virginia, sadly, we had a school system, Prince Edward County, that closed their entire school system for years rather than integrate. Governor Warner and I worked together with legislators to create a scholarship so that even 50 and 60-year-olds who hadn't been able to get the education they wanted to, if they wanted to go and get an education now, the state would help pay for that. And I think educational investments to raise human capital is part of what we do to deal with the consequences that still exist today.
There are many who look at slavery and its legacy and say it's a direct line to that and the conflict between communities, especially the black community, and law enforcement.
There are connections there. There definitely are connections. But I'll tell you, in a lot of communities, the police and community relationship, it gets it right. When I was elected to city council in Richmond, we had the second highest homicide rate in the United States, and the homicides were largely in our minority communities. We had to make law enforcement changes and build bonds and build ties, and many communities do that, but some don't.
Yeah, but that's the question then. How do you deal with those who don't?
Well, look, we have to push communities to embrace what I call a community policing model, where they try to deal with crime by building stronger ties. And then the other thing we have to do, Charlie, this is really important. We've made police and sheriffs, in many instances, sadly, the front line for mental health problems in the country because we don't treat mental health. So many of the instances that become flashpoints, if you get to the bottom of it, there's a mental health issue, sometimes diagnosed but untreated mental health. And I have sheriffs who talk to me all the time. I don't want to have a jail where 2/3 of the people here really aren't criminals. They're mentally ill, but because we don't treat mental illness, they end up doing something wrong and in jail. So solving this problem, you got to build better relations and have more mental health care.
Your running mate has a very different idea about mass incarceration than her husband did when he was president.
A long time ago, sure. I think we've learned from painful experience that as a nation, we are so far out of whack with the rest of the world in the way we use incarceration. We have to dramatically change that. And so Hillary and I both strongly support criminal justice reform, which isn't just about sentencing, it's also about
But
policing.
recognizing the mistakes that happened in the 90s.
Yeah, she's acknowledged, look, the crime bill in '94, it had consequences that went farther than we wanted. We've got to roll that back. And I think there is some bipartisan interest in doing this now.
Before we move on to news of the day and the campaign, I'd love to know your thoughts about this museum opening up, because I know you've seen it.
Yeah.
We can't wait to go live and actually be inside it, and what it represents and what it means.
It's a people's museum. You know, in 2019, we will commemorate 400 years of the arrival of African Americans into the English colonies at Jamestown, 1619. And as I said, if you look at that history, it's only been in the last 50 years that African Americans of the entire 400 have been entitled to legal equality. There's a lot of pain to that story, but there's a lot of triumph overcoming adversity. The cool thing about the museum, and I know the director, is the Smithsonian is
just
been working on it for 10 years.
Yes.
So the Smithsonian has had a great collection that will be used, but they've also gone out to families and said, give us memorabilia. It's going to be a people's museum. And I think it will be a great generator of conversations that we need to have as a nation.
Can we get to some of the news of the day? Your contemporary, the one you're running against,
Yeah.
Mike Pence, said yesterday that he thinks it's inarguable that Vladimir Putin has been a stronger leader in this country than Barack Obama has been in this country.
Nora, my heart sunk when I heard this, because what about invading other countries is leadership? What about running your economy into the ground as leadership? What about persecuting LGBT Russians as leadership? What about setting up journalists and imprisoning them and even killing them as leadership? There's a difference between dictatorship and leadership. And if you don't understand that, I mean, you wouldn't get out of a 5th grade civics exam if you don't understand the difference between dictatorship and leadership. It also demonstrates just an irrational hostility toward President Obama that I don't get. How anybody could look at a Vladimir Putin. Because of state-run doping scandal, they just banned all Russian athletes, even Paralympians, from the Olympics. That's not leadership. But saying that Putin is a better leader than President Obama, I think it just betrays an irrationality and a hostility toward the president that is unpatriotic.
Do you think that the Russians are trying to hack into not only the DNC?
Absolutely.
In order to influence the election? That they want to see Donald Trump elected because they think they'll get a better deal with him?
Well, first, Charlie, it's very clear that the Russians were behind the DNC attack.
And their motive?
At a minimum, it's to delegitimize the election. At a minimum, it's that. But remember, when a presidential candidate encouraged crooks to commit espionage against the DNC in a presidential year to gain an edge, we impeached Richard Nixon and he resigned. When Donald Trump went on the air publicly and said to the Russians, hey, go ahead and hack away, and if you find something that helps me out, let me have it, we impeached a president for that, what he has encouraged Russia to do.
You got your first intelligence briefing yesterday. The news today, North Korea has launched a possible 5th nuclear test. What would President Clinton do to prevent North Korea from sending a ballistic warhead to the United States?
Well, a couple of things. First, I'm on the Foreign Relations Committee, and we worked on the sanctions package that the Congress adopted and then the UN adopted, giving the president very vigorous sanctions tools. So I know Hillary Clinton is going to use that sanctions power to the utmost to really squeeze those who are supplying North Korea. That's number one. Second, we have to get other nations engaged. China has put out a statement condemning this nuclear attack. They don't want instability on their border, and I think this is a wake-up call for them, and we have to demand that they use their influence. And third, the last thing we should do is be cavalier about nations getting nuclear weapons. Hillary has been very involved in trying to control nuclear weapons as Secretary of State. Donald Trump has said, well, maybe more nations, Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea, maybe more nations should get nuclear weapons. That would be a disaster for the world. We're going to control nukes, not allow them to proliferate.
Yesterday, Senator Kaine, Mike Pence said that he has a stand-in for you for getting ready for the debates. Who's your stand-in, and how are you getting ready?
That is well, the stand-in is the most closely guarded secret. But, you know, getting ready, I've done a lot of debates. I'll tell you, this is a different one because it's not really
Senator,
Pence v. Kaine.
We have to go.
Yeah, it's Clinton v. Trump.
Elaine Quijano from CBS is moderating. I know
It's
we got to go.
be challenging.
I know,
Yeah.
we got to go. We got to
Thank
go.
you, guys. Great to be with you.
Thank
this
you.
morning.
Hope you'll come back.
Yeah.
Be sure to tune in this Monday, September 12th, when CBS This Morning will broadcast live from the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Colin Powell, Representative John Lewis, Attorney General Loretta Lynch will be among our guests. And before that, on Sunday morning, Gail will join John Dickerson on Face the Nation with a preview. That's right here on CBS.